Here's a fact that breaks the usual story about Gen X and money. They save more than millennials. They are less likely to raid their retirement accounts early. On most measures of financial discipline, the generation born between 1965 and 1980 behaves more responsibly than the one behind it. And they are also the most frightened. In one large survey, 70% of Gen Xers said they fear running out of money in retirement more than they fear death. That is higher than millennials and higher than boomers. So the story cannot be that Gen X is bad with money. The behavior says the opposite. Something stranger is going on, where a generation doing many of the right things feels more doom about it than the generations doing fewer of them. That gap between the behavior and the feeling is what this video is actually about, because the psychology lives in the gap. Let me start with the fact that explains most of the anxiety, and it is not a personality flaw, it is an accident of timing. The generation that got handed the controls. Gen X is the first generation of American workers expected to fund retirement primarily out of their own savings. For their parents, retirement was often a pension. You worked, and at the end, a defined amount arrived every month for the rest of your life, and somebody else carried the risk of making that happen. You did not have to understand markets. You did not have to choose a contribution rate. You did not have to guess how long you would live and divide your savings by it. Then, across the 1980s and 90s, exactly when Gen X was entering the workforce, that system was quietly dismantled and replaced with the 401k. Only about 14% of Gen Xers have access to a traditional pension, against 44% of boomers. Financial planners have a name for this cohort. They call Gen X the 401k experiment generation. The guinea pigs, and they mean it fairly literally, because Gen X got the new system before it had any of the features that make it work. No automatic enrollment, no automatic escalation of contributions, no target date funds that invest sensibly on your behalf. Those all arrived later for millennials and Gen Z. So picture the actual situation. A 25-year-old in 1992 handed a brand new kind of account, told to voluntarily choose a percentage of a small early career salary to lock away for 40 years into investments they were given almost no education about, with no default settings to catch them if they did nothing. Most people, faced with that, undercontributed. Not because they were reckless, because every part of the system that now nudges people towards saving did not yet exist, and the entire weight of the decision sat on an individual who had never been taught to carry it. The psychology here is not irresponsibility. It is the weight of unfamiliar responsibility landing on people with no map, and that is the root of the anxiety. Because when the outcome is entirely your fault by design, every shortfall feels like a personal failing rather than a structural one. The squeeze in the middle. Now add the thing that arrived at the worst possible moment. Gen X is the core of what gets called the sandwich generation, the people supporting children on one side and aging parents on the other at the same time out of the same income. Roughly a quarter of American adults are sandwiched this way, and it lands most heavily on people in their 40s and 50s. Around half of adults in that age band have both a living parent over 65 and a child they are still raising or financially supporting. Caregiving of this kind costs, on average, more than $10,000 and 75 hours a month. Here's the part that matters for the money story. In one study, 59% of sandwich generation caregivers said they had reduced or stopped contributing to their retirement savings because of it. Read that against the previous section. This is the one generation that has to fund its own retirement with no pension and no safety net. And it is also the generation being asked to divert money away from that exact task in its peak earning years, toward people it loves and will not say no to. That is not a spending problem. Nobody in that situation is failing a discipline test. They are making a rational and often unavoidable choice to support family now and paying for it with their own future security, and then feeling the anxiety of the shortfall they can see coming and cannot easily prevent. The behavior and the feeling line up perfectly once you see the trap. They are anxious because they are correctly reading a genuinely difficult situation, not because they are catastrophizing. The history that taught them not to trust the plan. There is a third layer, and it is about what this generation watched happen. A Gen Xer who started saving in the mid-90s has now lived through the dot-com crash at the turn of the millennium, the 2008 financial crisis, and the 2020 pandemic crash. 3 times. They watched a decade of careful saving get cut down in months by something they had no control over. That does something to a person's relationship with money that is entirely rational and also quietly corrosive. It teaches you that the plan can betray you, that doing everything right is not the same as being safe, and it produces a specific and well-documented behavior. Gen X holds an unusually large share of its retirement money in cash rather than investments. In one survey, they were parking around a third of their retirement assets in cash, despite still having years for that money to grow. From the inside, cash feels safe. It does not crash, you can see it. After watching the market vaporize your savings 3 times, wanting to hold something that cannot fall is a completely understandable emotional response. But over a long horizon, it is usually the more dangerous choice, because inflation eats cash slowly and reliably while the person feels protected. This is loss aversion doing real financial damage. The pain of a visible crash looms far larger in the mind than the slow invisible erosion of money that never gets the chance to grow. So people choose the quiet loss to avoid the loud one, and feel prudent while doing it. Why competence and confidence came apart. Put those 3 layers together and you get the strange signature of Gen X money psychology. They are by most measures competent. They save. They are self-reliant. Many describe themselves as confident in their own investment decisions. This is the latchkey generation, the one that learned early to handle things without being managed, and it carried that self-reliance into its finances. And yet a large share have never made a formal plan. In the surveys, something close to half of Gen Xers say they have done no retirement planning at all, and only about a quarter work with any kind of financial advisor. That combination, high self-reliance and low formal planning, is not a contradiction once you understand where it came from. A generation raised to solve its own problems, handed a system with no instructions, burned 3 times by forces outside its control, learns a particular lesson. Trust yourself, keep your options open, hold something safe, and do not put too much faith in any grand plan, because you have watched grand plans fail. Every one of those instincts is understandable. Several of them are actively working against the person holding them. Self-reliance without a plan means nobody is checking your assumptions. Holding cash to feel safe means missing the growth you need. And treating the whole subject as a private burden to be shouldered alone, which is very on brand for this generation, is precisely the thing that keeps people from getting the outside help that would actually reduce the fear. What the psychology suggests rather than what to buy. I'm not going to hand you a set of hot financial tips, because this is a psychology channel and because the useful moves here are behavioral before they are financial. The first is to correctly relocate the blame. A great deal of Gen X money anxiety is a structural situation being experienced as a personal failing. You were handed an experimental system with no instructions and asked to absorb risks. Your parents never had to. Naming that accurately does not fix the balance, but it changes the feeling from shame, which makes people avoid the subject, to something more like a problem, which makes people face it. The second is to notice where a feeling is driving a costly decision. The pull toward cash is the clearest example. It is an emotional response to remembered pain, and it feels like caution while quietly working against you. Simply knowing that loss aversion is the mechanism makes it easier to question the instinct rather than obey it. The third is the hardest for this specific generation, and it is to treat asking for help as competence rather than surrender. The self-reliance that got Gen X through the latchkey years actively resists this. But the data is fairly clear that the people who do worst are not the ones who make mistakes. They are the ones who never make a plan at all, and never let anyone look at the assumptions they have been quietly carrying. And the fourth is the one nobody wants to hear, which is that the fear itself is information rather than an enemy. 70% of a generation fearing they will outlive their money is not mass irrationality. It is a broadly accurate signal about a genuinely difficult set of circumstances. The mistake is not feeling it. The mistake is letting it sit as dread instead of converting it into a specific, boring, answerable question. What are the actual numbers? Dread makes people avoid the spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet is the only thing that ever makes the dread smaller. The real point, the story you usually hear, is that Gen X is bad with money. The data does not support that. This is a disciplined, self-reliant generation that got handed the hardest financial deal of any living cohort, and is largely handling it without complaint. The anxiety is not a character defect. It is the accurate emotional read of being the first people asked to do something genuinely difficult, with no instructions while supporting everyone on both sides of them after watching the system fail 3 times. Understanding that does not make the shortfall disappear, but it moves the whole thing out of the territory of shame, where nothing gets solved, and into the territory of circumstance, where things occasionally do. And it points at the one move that consistently helps, which is refusing to carry it silently and alone, which is the exact thing this generation was trained to do, and the exact thing it most needs to stop doing here. That is the cue most people miss. If you're Gen X, which of these did you recognize: the cash, the silence, or the fear itself? Leave it in the comments, subscribe to Psychology Q, and I will keep showing you the signals hiding in plain sight.